Hi everyone. So my name is Luke Muehlhauser, and I was a baptized, born-again, Bible-believing son of a preacher man for 21 years in Minnesota. And at age 20, all I wanted to do with my life was to be like Jesus to a lost and hurting world. That's all I wanted to do with my life. But that meant that I had to find out what Jesus was really like. And so I studied the historical Jesus, and I learned a lot of things, even from Christian scholars, that were shocking to me. The New Testament authors have different theologies. The Bible's full of contradictions, of course. And in fact, the mission of Jesus was quite different than the mission of Paul. And believe it or not, it was the mission of Paul that became Christianity as we know it today. So Christianity should really be called Paulinism or something like that. Now, this was all very scary to me because I really wanted to be a Christian. Everything in my life was revolved around being a Christian. So my plans, my hopes, my dreams, all of that depended on me being a Christian. But I just couldn't believe after all of those things that I had learned. But I wanted to recover my faith, so I read lots of conservative Christian scholars to try to recover my faith. And I decided that just to be fair, I should read a little bit of skeptical material as well. And what I found was that the skeptics, they just made plain, simple sense, and meanwhile, the Christian apologists had to do these outrageous intellectual backflips to try to say that Christianity was defensible. And so I lost my faith, and like Jonathan said, now I run a popular website on atheism and morality. But the title of my talk today is Why the New Atheists Failed and How to Defeat All Religious Arguments in One Easy Step. And I know that some of that will be controversial for different people, and if you came here because you want to disprove what I'm going to say, then I think that would be awesome, and you should ask as a question in the question and answer period after the talk, because that would be really interesting to all of us, I think. And that's a really sensationalistic title, and so I hope you're all skeptical, right? But I do want to say that nothing I'm going to say here is original to me. I didn't come up with any of this stuff. All I'm doing, and this is almost all I do on my website as well, is to kind of summarize and simplify what professional philosophers are saying in their scholarly journals back and forth that nobody reads. So the first part of my talk, why the new atheists failed. You might say, Luke, what do you mean the new atheists failed? That's crazy. Atheists are coming out of the closet in droves. The famous new atheists like Dawkins and Harris are selling millions of copies of their books. They're on radio and TV all over the place. And atheists have a lot more confidence. They're all over the place. So you call that failure? Well, no, of course not. I am tremendously grateful as an atheist to the new atheists for doing tremendous good for non-believers around the world. What they failed at is something quite different, but it is something that's very important to the new atheists, and that is they failed to give a good intellectual case for atheism. And I'm sure Richard Dawkins would be very unhappy with me if he heard me say that, but it's not actually that controversial among the people who do argue about the existence of God for a living, professional philosophers. For my show on my website, I have spoken with and interviewed dozens of them, professional philosophers, and none of them really think that the new atheists have made a good case for atheism. The religious philosophers are very eager to talk about the new atheists because they get to show how bad their arguments are. And then the atheistic philosophers mostly just ignore them because they've got good arguments for atheism that they're working on, and there's just really nothing to work with in the new atheists. So that's not really very controversial among professional philosophers, and I'd like to explain why. I'll give just two examples. The first is from what Richard Dawkins calls the central argument of his book, The God Delusion. And it's this 6-step argument that he outlines in his book, and it goes something like this. He says, look, if you're going to posit that God is the best explanation for some complex thing like the bacterial flagellar motor or the human eye or something like that, then that doesn't really help anything because an intelligent designer of that kind of thing has to be even more complex. You know, your brain, when you create something, is a lot more complex than that thing that you create. And so if you're going to say that it's unlikely that complex things should come into existence, therefore we need God to explain it, then you've got an even bigger problem with God because he's even more complex. And so it's very unlikely that God, as a complex, intelligent designer, would ever have come into existence. If anything, God would have to come about by a long, slow, gradual process like evolution. And so that's the gist of his argument. Why does it fail? Again, remember, this is the central argument of Dawkins' book. The first problem is that it's just, in the 6 steps that he gives, it's just logically invalid. So even if all of his premises were true, which I'm not sure they are, they wouldn't even support his conclusion. And that's very strange because I know that he gave his book to Daniel Dennett, who's a professional philosopher, and he would have noticed an invalid argument. So that's a big problem. Now you might say, well, let's be charitable. Maybe Dawkins wasn't trying to give a logical argument. Maybe he was just trying to give kind of a messy outline towards some argument that he wants to give, but just never does. Either way, that's not very helpful. But there's another problem with Dawkins' argument, and that is that it aims itself towards a God that almost nobody believes in. Let me explain. The God of Christians and Muslims and Jews has many properties. He's all-knowing, he's perfectly good, he's all-powerful, he is personal, he's non-physical, right? You're all familiar with that. And he's also eternal and necessary. And it's those last two where Dawkins is missing the point. Because God, as hypothesized by religious people, is not supposed to be a being like you or I, where we kind of came into existence, and there was a chance that I might have existed, there's a chance I might not have existed. I'm a contingent being that way. My existence is contingent. The God that Christians, Jews, and Muslims are talking about is not a contingent being. If he exists, he's a necessary, eternal part of the universe. So when you say that it's unlikely that God would come into exist, Christians, Jews, and Muslims will go, that's fine, I don't believe in a God that came into existence. And so that's a little bit technical, and we could talk more about that later, but this is all coming from a paper by an atheistic philosopher, Eric Muehlhauser, who tried to resurrect Dawkins' argument into some kind of logical form, and then he found that it failed anyway. So those are some major problems with the central argument of the most popular book by the most respected new atheist. It's, in my braver moments, I call it the epic fail of the new atheism. Again, this is the central argument of the most popular book by the most respected new atheist, and it's a complete failure. It fails in almost every way that an argument can fail. So before I get stoned by all the atheists in the audience, let me give one more example. Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. On page 71, he says something like, the postulate of a designer or creator of the world gets us nowhere because it just leads to the question, who designed the designer? And religion and theology have consistently failed to answer this objection. Right? Who designed the designer? Who made God? This is a question that a 5-year-old can ask. But it's a bad argument, and I'd like to explain why, and I get a lot of criticism for this because it's very popular to say who designed the designer. But anyone who's done Philosophy of Science 101 will know that that's not a good objection, and I'll explain why. Imagine, well, you'll probably remember the day when you were a kid and you realized that you can ask a why question of your parent, and then whatever they say back to you, you can just say why again, forever and ever and ever. Yeah. Remember? So it would go something like this. Daddy, why do birds fly? And Daddy might say, to get food for the baby birds. Why? So the baby birds don't starve. Why? Because they need energy to keep living. Why? I don't know, Daddy's tired. Please go away. Something like that, right? And the truth is that even if Daddy was a professional biologist, there would still come a time when he could not answer the why question. And scientists know this. In the 19th century, oh, that's why. Any Animaniacs fans?
Yeah.
Come on, represent. All right, so scientists in the 19th century proposed atoms to explain certain observations that they made. And they were correct. That was the correct explanation. But they had no idea what could explain atoms themselves. And today, physicists are positing things like electrons and photons to explain certain things that we observe, but they have no idea what explains electrons and photons themselves.